Libby, Billy.
Hello world, Billy here again. It's been a minute. Yeah, it's been a minute, but it's good to be here again recording a video, and I'm going to try and keep this somewhat short. I hope everyone's doing well since the last time you watched one of these, and yeah, today I just wanted to touch on this notion of deeming God faithful. Deeming God faithful, and sort of the premise or what prompted this was something that was being discussed in church today during service, and it was about Daniel and a few other examples, but just focusing on Daniel as the primary example here. It was on him choosing or determining in his mind, first of all, that before, in the midst of pressure or in the midst of exile and being carried away to a different nation, Babylon, he proposed in his heart to not defile himself. So it all began there, despite the fact that I guess it would have been natural or it would have been reasonable to some degree, that a possible response to everything that was going on, like experiencing carnage, like pillaging of Israel, pillaging of his nation, possibly like the death of his parents, which we're not quite sure about, but being being taken to a different nation, having to learn their customs, their cultures, having to basically renaturalize in a completely different place. A possible natural response to that would have been to essentially forsake his God, if I can sum it up that way, to forsake his belief in God. And yet he didn't. He proposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, and the underpinning of this is that he deemed God faithful. He deemed that God was worth continuing to be believed in. He deemed that God was worth his sustained belief, Daniel's own sustained belief. And yeah, I don't know, I guess it got me thinking of just the notion of, you look at Joseph, for instance, right? Joseph was sold to some merchants, and then he's eventually sold to Potiphar's house, and in there he still espouses his belief in God, and even when it would be temporarily advantageous to him to have relations with Potiphar's wife, he doesn't. And what he says is very telling, right? That it's because of his deep-rooted belief in God's faithfulness. He says, how can I do this and do this great wickedness against God? So even when it would be quote unquote a natural consequence, like a reasonable or seemingly valid consequence to disregard of his belief, disregard of his principles, his faith in God, even like when it would seem fine to do that, he doesn't. And the underpinning isn't that he's just a good person, it's that he recognizes that God is worth his sustained belief in. He recognizes that God is faithful, therefore he's not going to do something that would dishonor God, something that would something that would bring shame to God, something that would make God unhappy, something that would displease God. And yeah, I guess it also made me think of, there was this course that I took in my undergraduate studies. It was called Formal Languages and Automata, and it's a very theoretical course, but essentially you can think of it as studying the principles of what makes, I'd say, like modern language, like modern programming languages. So you're sort of looking into building these things that are called automata, machines, but they're not like mechanical machines. They're sort of thought machines, thought experiments. So for instance, the Turing machine, you might know what the Turing machine is, but it's something that can solve, machines that can solve like simple problems. So say you have a machine that takes a piece of tape, and on this tape they're like instructions, so it reads the instructions on the tape and then it performs some action. So if it sees like an arrow that that points up, then it does something. If it sees an arrow going left, it does something. And in formal languages and automata, when you're building these machines, or building these automata, you sort of go, like, you're doing a lot of, like, I guess low level logic, but you're working on things called, like, you hear words like a lemma or an axiom. And for instance, an axiom is sort of this underlying truth that does not require proof. Is basically something you take as a, what you might call a presupposition. So it's not something that needs to be, there's nothing lower than it, there's nothing higher than it, everything else basically sits on top of that. So for instance, in the case of an automata that reads a piece of tape, you're basically presuming that the machine can accurately interpret the instructions. So that's maybe an axiom. You're also interpreting that, or you're also presuming, or there's an axiom that the tape itself does contain instructions, so it's not null, it's not void, that things will happen. So that's like an axiom. So in the context of, I guess, all of this, the Holy Spirit was just ministering to me, like, a lot of the times as human beings we forget, or we're forgetful. It's one of our natures, because when we go through life, like when we, I guess, perceive reality, we're not constantly holding a list of things that we know to be true at the back of our minds. Our subconscious sort of does that for us, so we don't have to, our conscious minds don't have to constantly be thinking, okay, I know where I'm from, I know who my parents are. Like, you're not always thinking of those. When you need to think of those in some context, then you recall them. But those are essentially axioms, right? Things that will never change. But a lot of the times, or sometimes, we forget some of these axioms, especially when they're axioms that relate to God. So for instance, God's faithfulness. And so because of that, because we're not maybe having them at the forefront of our minds, or because we're not recalling them when we need to, we essentially would do things that, again, would seem natural, like a natural consequence to some circumstance that has happened, but it's not incompatible, like it's incongruent, it's not incompatibility with what a regenerated spirit, or what a regenerated person would do. So for instance, there's so many things going on. Say for instance, you move to a nation, you're not able to find work, and there are things that people are telling you to do, or like suggesting you should do in order to make ends meet. Do things that don't fall within the confines of, say, the rules within where you are. Now it would be easy to, again, because we only know in part, it would be easy to say, well, maybe God isn't faithful, and so you sort of disregard your principles and you take the suggestions of people on, and skirt the laws and all of that, and do things that, again, seem natural, they seem consequent. You need to have money to, like, survive, right? And yet the answer there, the solution there, isn't to say, well, God is not faithful, I'm going to do my own thing, I'm going to satisfy my needs and according to the flesh. The answer there is to say, how can I do this great wickedness against? It's to remember the axioms, to axiomize, like, first of all, to axiomize things like God is faithful, God is true, regardless of what is happening, regardless of whether I understand how things have played out. If I'm in alignment with Him and with His will, He's faithful, right? So our responsibility, I guess, as humans, forgetful humans, is to, first of all, abide in the Word. That what have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you, is to constantly immerse ourselves in the Word, so that we axiomize things. We get to the point where, like, these things are basic principles, basic tenets at the backs of our minds, and then to recall those axioms, to remember God even in the midst of those circumstances. So when you're Joseph in Egypt, or you're Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in Babylon, or you're Esther, in the palace of King Ahasuerus, like, you remember these axioms that God is faithful, God is true, and you proceed, you do the thing that is not necessarily natural, but the thing that is in alignment with those axioms. So you flee all appearance of evil, whatever shape or form that may take. You take a stand against laws or instructions that seem okay, but that go against the word of God. And you confront darkness, like you do good, truly do good, not just in following the law, like the written law, but you let the Spirit of God within you instruct you on what is good to do, and you carry out to do it. And just to drive this point home about axioms, so remember I said axioms are these underlying presumptions, presuppositions, so they don't require proof, they simply just are. There's, on the other hand, in the context of what we're talking about, what you would call evidence. So evidence is typically some fact. Evidence is typically some fact that supports some proposition. Now, the issue with evidence, a lot of the time, or a possible issue with evidence, is that it's up for interpretation. And so in like a bank robbery or like a murder case or some crime, you have evidence that is presented, and that evidence can support the defendant's case or the prosecutor's case. Sometimes, and this is something that obviously the law tries to account for, sometimes you have scenarios where evidence seems to support the evidence is inaccurately interpreted, if I can put it that way. It's either presented in a way, or just as it is, lends more towards an untrue conclusion. So in this context, the evidence of being exiled to Babylon, or being sold by your brothers, or being taken, for instance, if you're Esther, being taken from your peoples and being now thrown into this patriarchal like setting where you now have to be queen, even though it's not exactly what maybe you would have chosen, you would have opted for, but the evidence there would point or seem to point to the fact that, or even like Job, like Job losing his family, the evidence there would seem to point at God not being faithful. And yet, in all of those scenarios, each of these individuals deemed God faithful. They didn't rely on the evidence that would seem to lend itself to one conclusion. They relied on the axiom, on the thing that does not require proof, just the very underlying, inherent, unshakable premise that God is faithful. And so, yeah, it's important that we challenge ourselves and that we deem God faithful, regardless of what goes on, whether you're experiencing good, whether you're experiencing bad, whether time and chance, are happening to you right now in this season of life. God is faithful, and we don't need evidence for that. He is good. He does do good things. He shows us that He is good, even when it doesn't seem like it. Even when it doesn't seem like it, God is actively showing us His goodness. And yet, undeniably, even without evidence, without proof itself, God is faithful. Something else that I was thinking about is that a lot of the times, if we take reality for instance, right, or truths, that things that are foundational to what we call reality, many of the things that form the basis of reality, or a lot of the underlying things that form the basis of reality, are not quite understood, and yet we continue to do life, if that makes sense. So there was once a point in time where like the model of the world, like the Greeks had a model of the world that was that was geocentric, right? That was Earth centered. And then, with advancements, we realized that no, it's heliocentric. It revolves around the sun. But what I'm trying to say is we might not always be able to lay the full reason for the scope of things that are happening to us, and yet that does not change God's consistency. It does not change those attributes about him that make God God, those attributes that make him worth believing in. So his faithfulness, his steadfastness, his long suffering, his compassion, his loving nature towards us, like regardless of whether or not we're able to justify some of the circumstances that are taking place in our lives or even outside of our lives, those things, they're happenings or they're not happenings, whether good befalls you or whether bad, befalls you, those things, God's faithfulness is not contingent on those things. And so it would be to our great, I'd say, I don't know, disadvantage, not just functionally, but it would be very sad if, circumstances cause us to believe that God is less faithful or less true than he's always been. So I hope this encourages you, and I'll see you I'll see you hopefully when I see you. I love you with the love of Christ, and see you in the next one. Bye.